All right, let's jump right in. When we hear the book of Revelation, our minds almost instantly go straight to those cinematic end of the world destruction scenes, right? Fire falling from the sky, literal monsters, global catastrophe, the whole shebang. But what if the earliest readers of this text didn't view it as a futuristic horror movie at all? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're zeroing in on the intense imagery of Revelation chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, the pouring out of the first bowl. And we're going to see exactly how ancient theologians decoded this terrifying apocalyptic vision, translating it into something deeply personal, surprisingly pastoral, and honestly intensely psychological. Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll kick things off by decoding the first bowl, then we'll look at the echoes of Egypt's plagues. After that, we'll dive into the church and divine wrath, explore the psychological toll of spiritual sores and apostasy, and wrap it all up by uncovering the mercy within the plagues. Okay, section 1, decoding the first bowl. We're looking at Revelation 16, verses 1 and 2. The physical imagery here is jarring, it's grotesque, and it really sets the stage for everything we're about to unpack. Pour out the bowls of the wrath of God. Foul and painful sores came on those who had the mark of the beast. Now, it's so easy to read words like wrath, foul, and painful sores and just immediately assume a literal doomsday, right? But the fascinating thing is, the early church fathers didn't stop at the surface level. They actually saw these as profound metaphors about the human soul and the ongoing everyday life of the church. Moving right along to section 2. Echoes of Egypt's plagues, the blueprint. Because to really understand how early theologians decoded all this, we actually have to look backward to a 2nd century thinker named Irenaeus. So Irenaeus relies heavily on a concept called typology. If you're not familiar, typology is basically a method of biblical interpretation where a historical event, which is called a type, prefigures a later spiritual reality. Think of it like a historical blueprint. For Irenaeus, the ultimate blueprint was the exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt. He made the case that those plagues of Egypt, which happened locally way back in the past, were actually an image of the plagues the nations will receive universally at the end of time. But the underlying purpose? Exactly the same. It's the divine guidance of the church's exodus out of the world and into her eternal inheritance. Section 3, the church and divine wrath, a present reality. So if these plagues represent a spiritual exodus, how exactly is this terrifying wrath of God being poured out right now? Well, early thinkers like Tychonius and Bede, they didn't view God's wrath as literal lightning bolts striking people down from the clouds. They radically redefined it. Tychonius believed this wrath is actually happening right now through the church's authority. His take was that when the church exercises judgment upon those who are unrepentant, but also mercifully grants absolution and forgiveness to those who actually change their ways, that is the bowl being poured out. Bede took a really similar angle. He argued that the wrath of God is poured out simply through the act of preaching. Just speaking the truth automatically exposes the impious. It makes them manifest. So rather than fire and brimstone, it's a present-day reality, a spiritual sorting mechanism happening right here, right now. Section 4, Spiritual Sores and Apostasy, the psychological toll. So what about the results of that preaching? The text explicitly says it caused foul and painful sores. The theologian Eustochius offered 2 distinct ways to look at this, and it brilliantly highlights the built-in tension of reading Revelation. On the one hand, you have the literal consummation, actual physical plagues, famines, and literal wars happening at the end of the world. But alternatively, he offers an allegorical approach. Drawing on the Gospels, he suggests these sores symbolize the deep anxiety and tribulations that vex the human soul whenever people hear rumors of wars. It's that internal dread, it's the mental anguish that plagues humanity. Which naturally leads us to a really fascinating question. Are these plagues meant to attack the body or the soul? Because if we lean into that allegorical side, the imagery of a foul and painful sore takes on an incredibly vivid internal meaning. Let's see how 3 distinct ancient voices answer this. Look at how these 3 historical figures translate what sounds like a grotesque physical affliction into these profound internal realities. First, Caesarius of Arles argues that the impious might be totally unharmed physically, but their sins of the will actually manifest as deep sores in their souls. Then we have Andrew of Caesarea, who equates the oozing pus of a literal sore to the throbbing grief in the hearts of apostates. These are people who realize they've turned away from God and find absolutely zero healing in the worldly idols they've chosen. And finally, Primasius. He views the sore as a mortal wound representing mass apostasy. He points out that just as unbelieving Jews historically rejected Jesus for the Antichrist, this apostasy is going to be imitated on a massive global scale by nations who accept the Antichrist, essentially marking themselves with the guilt of this eternal wound. I really want to pause on Andrew of Caesarea's imagery for a second here because it is incredibly potent. He wrote that this spiritual affliction is a, quote, a grief that throbs in the heart even as pus oozes from a sore. Wow. It's a remarkably visceral quote, isn't it? He's taking this gross, highly physical imagery right from the biblical text, and he uses it to emphasize something that's entirely invisible: the lofty, agonizing spiritual concept of human grief and deep regret when someone feels separated from the divine. All right, Section 5, Mercy Within the Plagues, Moderating Eternal Torment. I know, this all sounds incredibly bleak so far, but let's see how this builds into a surprisingly pastoral concept. So Andrew of Caesarea introduces an argument that just completely flips the script on apocalyptic dread. He argues that present suffering actually moderates eternal torments. Just let that sink in for a second. He's suggesting that God is fundamentally beneficent and kind to humankind, and because of this, God deliberately brings these terrifying present-day scourges upon those who deserve them right now in this life, specifically to lessen or moderate the unending torments of the coming age. In this view, the plagues aren't just punishment, they are an act of intervention. Andrew details that these moderating scourges, these divine interventions, manifest in the world through a few very specific ways. They arrive through prophets like Enoch and Elijah calling people out, through harsh, dramatic changes in the natural elements, or through the tragic sufferings that inevitably occur from human wars. It is a harsh reality, absolutely, but Andrew ultimately views it as a merciful, fatherly chastisement. The whole goal of this suffering is to drive humanity to tears of repentance, to basically cleanse their spiritual garments so they can ultimately enter into the joyous bridal chamber of Christ. So the plagues, incredibly enough, become a tool of grace. Which brings us to our conclusion today, and a question I really want to leave you with. How do these ancient psychological metaphors change the way we confront our own internal struggles today? I mean, we've journeyed from a text that sounds like a literal Hollywood doomsday scenario to a really profound exploration of spiritual reality. These ancient thinkers, they saw the bowls of wrath not as fire raining from the sky, but as the piercing truth of preaching. They saw the grotesque sores not as a physical disease, but as the throbbing grief of a disconnected soul. And most beautifully, they saw the terrifying plagues of life not as a sign of God's abandonment, but as a merciful fatherly attempt to wake us up. It completely changes how we read the text, and perhaps how we view the trials in our very own lives. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.